Thank you very much, everybody, and welcome to AMS Weatherband's latest webinar, Impact-Based Forecasts and Warnings, Effectiveness, Gaps, and Challenges, with Dr. Sally Potter and our moderator, Jen Walton. Before we begin, I would like to address some of the guidelines for our webinar today. If you have questions during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A on the button option on the bottom of your screen. Questions for speakers submitted through the chat will not be addressed. We will also have some specific time for questions from the audience after the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Jen, thank you so much for joining us. Jennifer Walton has 20 plus years of experience in strategic communications for climate-focused organizations. As founder of Girls Who Chase, she empowers women in meteorology. Jennifer now runs her own consulting firm advising on crisis communication and leadership. She holds a bachelor's from UNC Chapel Hill and an MS from Colorado State University. All righty, and with that being said, Jen, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you, Gideon. And thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker and our topic. Lots of really fascinating information to share. Dr. Sally Potter is a senior social scientist at GNS Science in New Zealand. She conducts research on the effectiveness of warnings and forecasts across all hazards, including impact-based warnings, risk perceptions, and behavioral responses. She applies the results to improve communication products and science advice. She's co-chair of the World Meteorological Association's WWRP High Impact Weather Project. So that's a lot, Sally, to have accomplished already. Tell me a little bit about your background. You have a background in geology and volcanology, as well as social sciences and risk communication and warning systems, as well as weather communication, which is all absolutely fascinating. So tell us how you got here.
Sure, thanks, Jen, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me along today. So yeah, my background is originally in geology and volcanology, and then during my PhD here in New Zealand, things sort of segued more towards social science and research and communication and alert level systems, how to communicate forecasts. And then that led me on to working with Met Service and looking more into these impact-based forecasts and warnings over the past about 10 years. So yeah, pretty broad background, but basically as my role in GNS, I'm helping our physical scientists communicate their forecasts, including during a response or a volcanic unrest, in the best possible way. And then whenever there's quiescence, like there's nothing going on, then we're conducting research to try and figure out how we can make these warnings and forecasts better. So we do things like surveys or focus groups and interviews, and we talk about how people want their information, what are their user needs, and then how can we tweak the maps and the writing and the text, the tables, the whole structure, like should we use scenarios for forecasts, etc., so that we can really try and provide all that awesome science, work that's been going on across the rest of the organization and the country in the best possible way to meet our audience needs. And we're trying to work on things like crowdsourcing as well to get a bit more two-way communication. So yeah, pretty broad, but a lot of the work I do is with the World Meteorological Organization now, through the World Weather Research Program High Impact Weather Project. Part of that is what are the gaps and challenges associated with impact-based forecasts and warnings. And so I'll be touching on that a bit today, and just generally how we're doing things in New Zealand, but also internationally, what's going on. Yeah, and just basically having a bit of a chat about what we can do to try and understand impact-based forecasts and warnings a bit more. And you can see I've put a map in there and I have pointed out where New Zealand is, just in case people aren't too familiar.
Thanks for that. Never know.
Yeah.
All right. I will go ahead and advance things forward for you here. So why don't we set some foundation around what you're researching, and then we can get into kind of some more of the Q&A.
Okay, sure. So quite a few years ago now, the WMO, or World Meteorological Organization, I'll just call them WMO from now, they said that we need to make our warnings more meaningful. So there were a few typhoons, hurricanes, cyclones, and things like that going on that caused a lot of impacts. And people decided that the reason this caused a lot of impacts was because people didn't understand what the warning was saying. They didn't know what storm surge is, for example. And so a way of addressing that is to emphasize the impacts more and have these impact-based forecasts and warnings. So since then, meteorological services around the world have been moving towards implementing these impact-based warnings. However, there is not a lot of evidence that supports how effective impact-based warnings are. And that's kind of where we come in as social scientists to look into this a bit more. So you can see on the screen here, the range of potential warnings. I'm going to go through these so we can figure out what these impact-based forecasts and warnings are. So a traditional type of warning is called a phenomenon-based warning. This is based on the level of hazard. So you can just go back one there, Jen.
Yeah, sure. That was interesting. It looks like my computer just decided to advance a slide.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So it's based on the level of hazard. So this is very traditional, right? The threshold to warn might be the wind speed. So it might be 100 kilometers per hour. I don't know what that is, miles per hour. I'm going to say like 60, but I haven't done the conversion. But if that's your blanket threshold, let's say across the whole country, then every time the wind is forecast to get over 100, then a warning is issued. So that does not take into account anything to do with where people are, where the buildings are, etc. So you can see on the left-hand side there, the colored bars, it's only got the hazard and the hazard likelihood in it. And the example here is that rainfall accumulations of 150 millimeters are expected within 18 hours within some sort of region tomorrow. Now, if we take into account people's vulnerability, this is the characteristics of those things that are at risk that make them more susceptible to damage. So I'm just talking about vulnerability at the moment. This is where things like a building that is made, has a concrete floor. Okay, that's going to be pretty strong. If there's a flood that comes through, you can pretty much wash it off and carry on. But if that floor is made out of wood and it sits there for a little bit, it's going to get soaked and rotten and you have to basically rebuild it. So the wooden building is more vulnerable than the concrete building. And you can do that for people as well and take into account people's capacities to respond. And so, for example, a person can actually move away from the area when a warning is issued. So they're less vulnerable than the building in some senses like that. So if you take into account this vulnerability, then the threshold that you are warning is based on the impacts, not the phenomena anymore. And this also to some degree takes into account exposure. And so the example here is rainfall accumulation of 50 millimeters expected within 18 hours, and perhaps a city, so your resolution might be getting a little bit higher here, which may result in road closures due to flooding. Now, an impact warning takes into account more that exposure. So if you think about exposure, that's basically where are the things, like the people, the buildings, in comparison to where the hazard's going to be. So if they're exposed, that means they're in the way. Okay, they're going to get impacted. And so this takes into account things like rush hour. Okay, so during rush hour, people are out on the roads, and if that's when the hazard comes along and overlays on top of that, then they're exposed and they're also going to be vulnerable to it. Okay, so the warning here is that you expect traffic to be delayed tomorrow at rush hour in the city due to the road closures from flooding caused by heavy rainfall. And then further along that spectrum then is the call to action warning. So this is when your threshold to warn is actually on what action you want people to take. And in this example, it's reconsider your commute home, blah, blah, blah. But it could be things like your threshold to warn is evacuation. And so that's the point that you warn. So there's this whole spectrum. And there are other foundations as well. During my PhD I revised New Zealand's volcanic alert level system. And we came up with all sorts of foundations that you can put a warning system on. In the volcano sense, it was where is the magma in the system, that kind of thing. So there's lots of possibilities here. Impact-based warnings is not the only one we should be considering. So hopefully that explains a little bit more about impact-based warnings. There is one other term called impact-oriented warnings. So Rainer Kaltenberger in Austria and his colleagues, they came up with this recently. which I quite like. And it is, instead of worrying about what's your foundation, what is your threshold to warn, it could be phenomena or hazard, or it could be impacts. It just has to have impact information in it. Then it's an impact-oriented warning. And I quite like that. And I think we should probably see a little bit more of that around in the literature. So that's that for that slide, Jen. Hopefully that was clear enough.
So I want to dig into volcanology a little bit, especially
Sure.
because I know there's a lot going on right now.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned that you're able to set parameters around any type of scenario relative to when you've reached a period of time when a volcano may erupt. So let's use Iceland's most recent eruption maybe as an example, or another volcano that you've been looking at. So how can you apply this model or this scenario to a volcanic eruption, and what are the criteria you might put around it?
That's a really good question. So in volcanology, the forecasting is not in the same position as in weather forecasting, right? Because with weather forecasting, you've got all these models and you can see what's happening in the atmosphere and that kind of thing. Whereas with volcanoes, it's all under the ground, and you have to it's basically trying to do it blind. You just have to feel for what's happening through earthquakes and the ground movement, and then try and basically guess where the magma is and what's it doing. Is it coming up to the surface or not? So those are all unrest indicators. So if we tried to put this kind of warning framework onto volcanology, at the moment, at the very, very best and at the peak of our abilities, we could produce a forecast of what the chances are of an eruption of various sizes, of various locations spatially, in a rough time window, right? So we've done it before for 24-hour time periods when we're really in crisis mode. Mainly it's more like 3-month time window. So the chances of an eruption, I'm going to use Taupo volcano in New Zealand. So this is a really big super volcano in the middle of our North Island. It had unrest started in May last year. We changed the alert level from 0, which is no unrest, up to 1 or minor unrest in September last year. And then it stayed at 1 right through to when we lowered it in May of this year. So what we did for that was we don't know where the vent could be if it was going to erupt. It's such a huge volcano, and the vents have been really in lots of different places. So that's the point at which the eruption actually comes from. And there's a giant lake over top of it. So it's very hard to know what's going on underneath that water. So the forecasting that we did, and we communicated this to the government, basically, and local government councils to help with their decision making, was on the likelihood for the current minor unrest to either go down, stay the same, or increase, or erupt in a small, medium, and large. So you can see that those are based on the phenomena, because that's where we're at with volcanology. If this became more of an impact-based warning, then you would be starting to have those thresholds based on what the impacts would be should that volcano erupt. And so with some volcanoes, you can kind of go, okay, if it erupts, it always goes, this way or down this valley. And so then that area could get warned more, have a higher level of warning than other areas, perhaps, because they're more likely to get impacted. And you could probably do this with ash fall quite well, which really has links to meteorology here. So if the ash is likely to land on a city, then that city could have a higher level of warning than other areas. But is that a good thing? I don't know, because there are always people in the countryside, that aren't in the city. They're still going to get impacted. And so shouldn't they deserve the same level of warning? So it all comes back to who the warning is for. And I'm going to touch on this again when it comes to the weather, the challenges with weather-based, impact-based forecasts and warnings. So I think, Jen, okay. So there's a lot of guidelines existing already for impact-based forecasts and warnings. So if anyone listening is really planning on implementing a system like this, I really recommend you have a look at those left-hand 2 documents there, the WMO ones. That's some guidelines on how you can go about doing it. There's also the Red Cross Red Crescent, the orangey looking one up there you could take a look at. The bottom right one is the checklist on how to have a good warning system. Amazing stuff in there. So it really lays out all 4 elements of a good warning system. It's not just the alerting, sending out a warning. That's not a warning system. A warning system is very inclusive of the risk-based approach, the whether or not you've got
sorry,
that's okay, no worries, whether you've got the education and training and the systems and the legislation and all those kind of things are wrapped into that. So really, if you haven't seen that before, go and have a look at that one. And then Towards the Perfect Weather Warning there, that's a book that we put out through the High Impact Weather Project. I think it was either last year or the year before, edited by Brian Golding. And this was a really mammoth effort by a huge number of people involved in the program to go down the whole value chain of what makes a good warning system. So this links up things like the decision maker to the communicator. And I think I was helping write that chapter. The communicator to I think it's the impact forecast. And it goes up the chain like that to say, how can we bridge across those? And I believe Brian is going to be talking a bit more about this in a future AMS Weather Band webinar. But it's open access. You could just Google that name and it should come up. And we all know, hopefully, that the UN has said that we need to have early warnings for all people by 2027. So this really emphasizes that we've got this effort going on at the moment to increase our early warning systems and the reach of those to try and get to all people around the world. A huge task, but I'm also helping through one of the activities at the WMO to try and address this. So it's a good time to be thinking about these impact-based forecasts and warnings, and just generally our warnings. Thanks, Jen.
Got it. Before I advance the slide, I know we've had some folks probably join us since we did our little introduction at the beginning. So I just wanted to reiterate, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function. We're not monitoring the chat for questions. And Sally's got some important information she's going to share with us, but we're going to try to make this a little bit informal. So I'm watching the questions coming in, and we'll infuse them throughout as appropriate, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can after she's completed her presentation function. So questions through the Q&A function, please. Okay.
Cool. So just a couple of examples here on how impact-based warnings are starting to be implemented. So on the left-hand side, you can see that's a little snapshot of New Zealand around the Auckland city area, our biggest city. And in January of this year, we had a big storm come through and Met Service issued this red warning. So following on for some research that we conducted a few years ago on impact-based warnings and how effective they are, Met Service went ahead and made these red warnings. So they say on their website, reserved for only the most extreme weather events, such as the severe weather resulting from extratropical cyclones where significant impact and disruption is expected. So what they do is when they see a severe weather event coming, they get on the phone to, say, Auckland Council, and they say, right, we've got this really severe event coming. Do you think it's going to cause super severe impacts, or do you think it's going to just not impact your area too much? And Auckland might say, you know what, we've just had this really wet time at the moment, so all the catchments are soaked and it's going to be causing flooding for us. So yeah, go ahead with the red warning. And so they can have that conversation, and that's like a discussion-oriented approach. It's a little more qualitative. They're using their own knowledge and experience instead of something like a quantitative risk model. And on the right-hand side there, that's the UK system as published by Andrea Taylor, which uses this risk matrix approach, the UK Met Office. So that's when you've got the likelihood versus the impact, and you can pick your colour basically off that table and apply that to the area, depending on how much impact they think is going to occur. And my understanding is that's the same sort of approach as New Zealand's Met Service, where it's that discussion-oriented approach. And having people co-located with agencies helps with understanding what those local impacts might be. Okay, so now we can go to the next slide, and that shows us what we did during a storm. Cyclone Gabriel hit New Zealand earlier this year in early February. We got the weather forecast data from NIWA. That's one of our New Zealand research institutes that does water and atmosphere. We made a landslide forecast within GNS Science for that. So you can see there the probability of landslides is showing in that more reddy orangey color. Now this is the impact forecast that was created based on that, the estimated number of landslides per kilometre on our state highways. So you can see there's a bit of a hotspot around Auckland and around the peninsula, which is called Coromandel. And then this one is the estimated number of number of properties that are likely to be affected by landslides per ward, per area kind of thing. So again, that Auckland area is showing up. So this was the first time that we have produced these impact forecasts for landslides in New Zealand. So rainfall-induced landslides as opposed to earthquake-induced landslides. And so they're very much trial at this point. And so we are going to be working with stakeholders to get their thoughts on that and what we need to do to improve these basically. But so these use an open source risk model called RiskScape. So I recommend you have a look into that. The website's at the bottom, or just Google it. You just need to have those different elements of risk in there. So that was the hazard, the vulnerability, and the exposure. And if you've got those, then the potential is there to start using it for impact-based forecasts or basically risk forecasts. So I think there's a lot of potential there that we're starting to move towards, especially in New Zealand. Okay, so we can probably, I don't know if we can stop sharing or just put it onto the next screen or whatever, but I'll talk a little bit more about, are these impact-based warnings actually effective? So we've done some research on this, looking at if our survey participants of the public received an impact forecast, then how effective is that in comparison to the people who receive a hazard forecast? So this is not related to what's on the screen, just so you know, so it's not too confusing there. And we found
just back up.
Yeah, probably. I don't know if it's easy enough to stop sharing or if that's going to mess with the system.
I don't want to stop sharing, but I
Sure.
will. I'll just back up to here and hope that my computer doesn't decide to.
Okay, no worries at all. And so in these surveys that we put out, we found that the people who received the impact forecast or impact-based warning, so that's the warning that had impacts likely to occur from this hypothetical event, they were more likely to have a higher level of understanding of what the impacts would be. They had higher threat perceptions and higher levels of concern, and there was no influence on their credibility of the warning. So that's really good news for impact-based warnings. It shows those risk perceptions are increasing. But when it comes to the amount of actions that people are taking, that was less clear. So the people who received an impact-based warnings were not more likely to act than the people who received a hazard-based warning. This is slightly more concerning for impact-based warnings and putting a lot of money and effort into them. However, it depends on what your audience is. So if it's for those individual members of the public, it might be that having those impacts in the warning message are like useful, but you know, not the golden egg or whatever, not the most influential thing that you could do. But if it's for the stakeholders, so you're doing it really at that city level, then it could be useful. And there's been less research done on that kind of audience. So something that we need to look into a bit more is how these are used by the different people. So yeah, that's
Sally.
Is that kind of clear enough? Because we can move into what our high weather group has been doing to do with challenges and benefits, if so. Okay, so while Jen's working on trying to get that screen shared again for the impact-based warnings group, I'll go through what we've been doing. So impact-based forecasts and warnings group under the High Impact Weather Project has been looking into what those gaps and challenges are so that we can kind of give some research directions for people around the world. The first thing we wanted to do was conduct a literature review to see what are the gaps already out there. Then we had a virtual workshop series, and this was held last year. There were 3 of them. We looked at various things in those 3, like what are the underpinning data and models needed? What is the multi-hazard aspects that we should be considering, and how can we make them more people-centered? And you can see in the map there on the right, those are the red are the countries of people who registered, and we had over 350 people register and participate in those. And then from that, we've been analysing the inputs, and we're going to be producing written outputs. We've drafted up a paper. We had a writing workshop in the UK in April to this group of about 15 international experts on this to try and think, what are those key gaps? How can we try and progress those going forward? So I'll go through some of the challenges that we've identified. But if you want to know more about the High Impact Weather Project or that particular impact-based forecasts and warnings project, have a look at our website at hiweather.net. That's hiweather.net. Okay, so one of the key challenges we found was to do with roles and responsibilities. Now, this shouldn't really be a big surprise. I think it comes up time and time again. But if you think about an impact-based warnings, often the National Hydrometeorological Service kind of owns or has that hazard data, right? That's the weather forecast. The people or agencies who kind of own and collect that vulnerability and exposure data or about the impact tends to not be the same agency. It's going to be emergency management, the local councils, health organizations, infrastructure agencies, it's all those kind of people. So whose role legally is it to put that information together and issue an impact-based warnings? That's one of the showstoppers for stopping these kind of impact-based forecasts and warnings from being produced. So really the answer here is that those agencies need to work together to share that data, and it has to be interoperable. But whose duty is it to actually put that warning out? Or can you have it, you know, there's always going to be a lead agency basically to put their name against this. You can still put out a consistent message across those agencies. Definitely that's the best thing to do. But you need to figure out in advance who's going to be the one that actually puts that message out. Now, some of the ways that you can work in partnership across these agencies is through things like co-location. So having someone from the Weather Service sitting in with one of those key agencies, for example, that can really help pull that data, you know, back to the Weather Service or the other way around and help with the sharing. I found that really useful. I'm based at an emergency management regional office here in New Zealand, because that way I can start to get to know what their needs are, and to do with all kind of forecasts and warnings and just their priorities in general, how busy they are, what they like, what they spend their time on. And then it really shows you what the role of our physical science information is in informing the work there. You need to have those written agreements in place. So it's very clear when there's a big storm coming or whatever that whose role it is and what the plan is. You can need to think about it in a multi-hazard approach as well, right? Where there is only one of many hazards that our key users are focusing on. And so if we get one type of warning, so let's say it was an impact-based warning from a Met Service, and then, you know, the volcanology forecasts are coming in a different format altogether with a completely different color scale or alert level system, or, you know, forecast or not. And then you have tsunami warnings in a completely different format, and you've got fire and you've got heat and you've got pandemics and you've got things outside of natural hazards. You know, these emergency managers have to deal with that whole range of warning systems basically and try and make them work. So I think we need to do a much better job at basically thinking outside our silos and looking across natural hazards and wider, to try and make this a little bit clearer for our key audience, which is the public at the end of the day. I've talked about the interoperability of the data and the systems as well. So trying to work in partnership across these agencies so that when the data is shared from one agency, it's not coming in basically as a PDF file that can't be put onto their GIS system, and then another agency is giving them something in a different format, and it'd just be nice to have it all interoperable and on one system. So that's that key challenge, roles and responsibilities. It also has parallels with the cost and feasibility of the systems. How are poorer nations able to produce something like this? If they can't collect all this exposure data, like where people are, what their vulnerabilities are, they haven't even perhaps got a weather service and weather forecasting system. It's a huge undertaking for them. So we kind of try and think about the spectrum of how you can go about implementing a system like this. You can have a very, hazard-based system, like the more traditional one, and you just take into account your general knowledge about what the impacts might be from the impending event. Or you could go right up through the spectrum and have a real quantitative underpinning model, like the RiskScape model I was showing before, with dynamic changing exposure data. So it changes whether it's rush hour or the middle of the night, whether it's summer holidays and people are at the beach versus just a winter's day when everyone's at work. And so people's location changed, and you can start to use things like mobile data perhaps and other aspects to get that information in. But that's getting really fancy. And does it even need to be that fancy? Is the warning going to actually be better at the end of the day if it's got all of that information in it? Is it worth the cost and the effort of collecting all that data and getting it into a system that helps with your weather forecast? Like, are people's actions actually going to be different whether or not they're receiving a warning based on that, or just the traditional hazard warning? These are questions that need to be answered. And basically, if you're thinking about implementing a system like this, you need to go down that road and go, what is the value of that kind of warning system before you just jump headlong into it? And then working in those partnerships can help with the cost and feasibility as well, because then you're not just reinventing the wheel yourself. You're working in partnership with the councils around you, or the Met Service in the next country, across the border, and that kind of thing, to share the cost of setting up this kind of system. And then working in the partnerships also helps with the communication. So having those consistent messages going out from multiple agencies, trying to go through the borders situation. So if one country's on one side of a border, one's on the other, is the warning going to just stop right on the border line, or is it actually going to overlap? How are you going to work with the next country over or region over for those consistent messaging? Another challenge, of course, is who is that target audience? Is it the public or is it the stakeholders? So that's something you have to work out right at the start. If your target audience is the public, then you have something called the rural-urban bias, and this is a key challenge with impact-based warnings. If you have this big storm coming over, let's say in New Zealand, Auckland City, and then it carries on to the neighbouring rural area with hardly anyone living there, should that city get the same level of warning as the rural area? Because the city has a lot more people and infrastructure, so they've a lot more exposure there compared to the people in the countryside. If that same system comes over and you're using an impact-based warning system, the city would get a higher level of warning, let's say a red warning, whereas the countryside would only get maybe an orange warning because there's just not going to be as many impacts because there's less people. Is that fair? Should that person in the countryside not receive also a red warning? Because to them, it could be life-threatening, So are we trying to empower the individuals, or are we trying to give that information from a Met Service to an emergency management agency to act on? Because they might want to know, yes, we're expecting more impacts at the city, because then they can get themselves ready for that. But so it depends who that audience is, and that really needs to be discussed and made clear right at the start. because otherwise you end up getting a case where the people in the countryside miss out, they get huge impacts to them individually, and they go, well, why didn't we get a red warning? This is not good enough kind of thing. So yeah, got to work through that one for sure. And then that feeds into tailoring of warnings. How specific and personalized can we get our warnings to be? At the moment, they're often region-wide warnings that come out because that's what our weather service, basically can currently do. So is there any way that we can get that warning to be more meaningful to individuals or to slightly higher level community groups, for example, either individual suburbs, or it might be more like a specific type of sector that's not spatially constrained, but, scattered across an area. It could be a church group or a education group or something like this, where it's a subset of the population in some way that might need a specific type of warning. It could be, rest homes for the elderly, that kind of sector scattered across this area. So obviously it's difficult to do tailored warnings at the moment because I think we feel we just don't have the information to help support that. And how do you even get the message just to those groups without going to individual Facebook group, level? So I've been thinking about that. And one of the ways that we might be able to do that is to use digital footprints. And I know this is kind of controversial and has a lot of potential issues like privacy and biases and legalities and all these kind of things. But if we could work in partnership with the tech giants who have this kind of information, our digital footprint information, it could feed into what our exposure is, where we are at any time, and where we might forecast to be. If it knows that we work on these certain days in a certain location, or we do school drop off at a certain time to a certain location with our kids, and all these kind of things, it could start to pull in this slightly more new age information to produce or inform these tailored warnings. So a lot of potential there, I think, for us to delve into a whole lot more, especially whether or not that's a good thing. Does that empower people if they get this kind of more meaningful information, or is it not that useful? And what do we need to do in order to go down that path in a wise and measured manner? Because just as a thought, I don't think the likes of Google are going to necessarily do this in the way that a National Met Service might do. So we need to work in partnership before it's just come in and done, with or without us, basically. So I think that's probably quite a lot for me at the moment, Jen. I might pause there, and I don't know if we're going to do a question at the moment, or I can carry on with more challenges, but I imagine there's probably some discussion that we could do.
Yeah, there's some great questions here, and several of them center around the notion of interoperability between countries, agencies, even the National Weather Service here in the States. And so let me see if I can formulate this into a question, at least to kind of give you something to jump off from. So the first question was, is NOAA coordinating their efforts on this with you, the UK, Met, and others? Because the coordination of silos seems to be a universal problem. So that's like part A. And then I would say, how can we model similar criteria across various countries? I think that's how I would word part B, so that we can kind of focus in this one area right now. Because obviously within the United States, there are issues in terms of how people understand impacts themselves, but then now you have to broaden that to an international vernacular. So what are thoughts on interoperability internationally?
Yeah. Okay. So yes, we've got a couple of people from NOAA involved in our in our international work and the National Weather Service people. So yes, the US is involved in that, and we always encourage more for sure in the WWRP work. And you can get involved in things like this by being part of your country's expert network for WMO. You can talk to your national member basically to get on that expert network, and then you're more likely to get selected to be part of these kind of projects. But even if you're not on the working group, there is often a call to participate in various kind of activities within it. So yeah, just if anyone's keen to be involved, I highly recommend you do, and you get in touch. Now, interoperability in terms of things like terminology, that's where it's good to be able to use the UN type of definitions about what vulnerability is, what exposure is, what hazard, all the terms that we tend to use. Should try and get them as standard as we can for these, in order to really know what each other's talking about. Now, New Zealand, as you can see on the map there, is just all by ourselves down in the bottom of the ocean. So we have less of kind of these cross-border issues. But from what I've heard from the likes of in Europe, where there's a lot of countries across these borders here, they have come together, and the likes of Meteor Alarm, so that they are working in these partnerships across the borders with the common terminology and systems to help make that interoperable. But yeah, other than that, interoperability of data is not really my area of expertise. And so you quickly get into things like common alerting protocol, using these common terms and templates that everybody can feed into, so that the alerts are quickly distributed across different platforms. So there are tools available to help kind of ease these warning messages across borders.
Awesome. Next question really lies in current events. And I'm going to make this part A and part B as well. Given the occurrences of extreme weather events in the US just in the past 3 to 4 weeks, where we've had several once in several 100-year events, wondering if impact-based warnings might have been more informative to the general public. So is an impact-based warning as opposed to a severe weather warning likely to be adopted? And part B is around best practices for communicating uncertainty, which are kind of aligned.
Yeah, sure. So I can't really talk about what the US is doing. Basically, I will leave that to the people who work in those organizations to share about where that is all at, basically. But in terms of communicating likelihoods and uncertainties, I would never use the 1 in 100 year type terminology. I think we all know that there are huge issues with that kind of thing, because people's perceptions are, oh, we've had it once in 100 years, we're not going to have it again, until next century, basically. So the way we do it is have more just the probability of certain size events happening. So we've done some research on this in New Zealand, based and using the international literature. People do like to have likelihoods and probabilities. Lots of people do. Some people don't, and that's fine. I think if it's out there, it informs the people who do want it. Okay, it empowers them to make their decision. So I think we should be including the forecasts, like likelihoods, 60% chance, blah, 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 a lot more in what we do to inform those people's decisions. There are different ways to do that effectively. There's a whole research field out there on this. So having, for example, there's a probability translation table by IPCC, possibly the WMO has one as well, which is when you have a number probability, you have the appropriate word next to it as well. So I think if it was 60% chance, then you would have likely in brackets. And there's been research done that when somebody hears 60%, they think of it as likely, and vice versa. So there's these kind of common terms that you can use to help communicate the probabilities. There are also challenges with this because it depends a little bit on your framing, if it's positive or negative. So your 60% chance of winning lotto versus the 60% chance of a very dangerous event occurring that might affect your life. So you have to take that as well. And more research needs to be done on this, as well as things like whether you can compare that probability with something else that's going to occur. So let's say it was a 1% chance I'm going to use volcanoes here, but of a very devastating volcanic eruption occurring. You could then say this is similar to the 1% chance of dying from, I don't know what it would be, like skydiving or going hiking on a glacier kind of thing. But the difficulty with those sort of comparisons is some people might be terrified of flying. And if that was your comparison, it's not very effective because, everyone has different perceptions on how dangerous flying is anyway. So you have to, there are different ways to get around this. And one is that you compare the likelihood now compared to what the likelihood was before. So you're using that same phenomena, but you're just looking at the relative differences in likelihood. So there's a lot of other things. You can do it graphically. And so there's a whole world of research out there that you can help and some guidance available on communicating that sort of uncertainty. In earthquakes, for earthquake forecasting, we use ranges, and we do that for volcanic eruption forecasting as well. Communicate the range and probability, and give a median as well for the earthquake forecasting to help people understand that uncertainty. Hopefully that answers it okay, Jen.
So to follow on that then, because the other thing obviously that needs to be factored in is how people receive information through their own lens of understanding. What have you all found relative to why people respond to warnings in different ways? And how does that impact how you might advise on how a warning is presented?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So we know that there are a lot of influences on people's response to a warning. So there's something called the Protective Action Decision Model by Lindell and Perry, 2012. So if anyone wants to look that up, I recommend it. And it shows why people respond in these different ways and how the information that they receive kind of feeds into their brain and gets processed in order to then decide whether or not to act. So some of the influences are things like environmental cues. So what can you see out the window? Can you see storm clouds brewing, or is it a blue sky day and then this flood that comes through just completely is out of the blue? You have social cues like, can you see your neighbor preparing to evacuate? Or do you see a bus that's been organized by the council to come and evacuate residents? Those kind of influences. What sort of information streams people like to look at or receive their information? Is it the once a day via the news? Is it radio and therefore more frequent? Is it social media? They're always on their phone getting push notifications and that sort of thing. Changes whether you're getting that warning information a lot or not very frequent. And is it at a national scale or is it, quite targeted to your little town? So if you think about these things, in terms of how we produce our forecasts and warnings and alerts, then you can start thinking of things like education around environmental cues, or even though it's a blue sky day today, just letting you know there's a good chance of a flood or something coming from up in the catchment. You can try to target multiple communication channels. So not just the news and the radio, but also trying to get through to more local sources to give people that more meaningful, localized information. The warning message itself is another influence. So that's where a lot of our work comes into it. So how you actually change the phrasing and the warning message, whether it's based on impacts or phenomena, etc. That's that influence. And also, of course, people's demographics, how many resources they've got in terms of social as well as economic, what their languages are, etc. So that's where in your warning message, you start thinking, what language shall I use? And also, can I make it have less jargon, technical language, acronyms? What language should we be using? Whether it's English or Spanish or what? so those are the ways that you can start building the knowledge about how people respond and receive warnings. You start putting that into the warning message, basically, to make it easier to understand and more actionable.
There are some questions here around what's factored in relative to the development of a warning. So, for example, how is infrastructure factored into the impact-based warning system? And what other information products are considered criteria for a certain type of impact-based warning?
Okay, so most agencies, countries, etc., would just focus on lives, fatalities. Basically, the chance of a fatality is what is the key impact that you're focusing on. But depending on what your focus is, it could be a bit more to do with property, infrastructure outages, and that sort of thing. So if you're doing a true quantitative risk model, you should be able to include infrastructure, exposure, and vulnerability. So RiskScape, for example, has our risk model has these fragility functions within it that can talk about how damaged a building is, depending on what its construction material is, what the likelihood of outages are from various infrastructure like electricity, power, roading, housing, that sort of thing. So if you have that fragility function layer, that's the vulnerability layer, and then you also have the exposure layer. So that means where the houses are, for example, where the infrastructure layers are. That's where you can start to overlay them in a risk model. If you don't have a risk model, then you're kind of doing it a little bit more, either just through GIS, overlaying those layers and eyeballing it, basically. Or you can start to use your sort of just your general knowledge. So you'll just know that if this tornado or this storm is going to go through, and you know that there's this really important highway or electricity substation in that area, then you might just go, okay, that's more likely to have an impact, and we'll raise the level to be a bit higher, because the downstream outages are going to be really disrupting to people. If the power's out in this particular substation, it's going to in fact impact this whole area downstream, basically. And so then those people could be warned as well, even though they're nowhere near that tornado. I don't really know much about tornado warnings. We can't do them in New Zealand. We're just too small. So, but that kind of thing, you can take infrastructure into account for sure. But it just depends on your mandate, really. As I said, most agencies really are to do with lives for these warnings.
So we've got about 8 minutes left. I want to make sure if there's anything else you'd like to cover from your presentation that you feel like we haven't gotten to, we have time for that.
Yeah, okay. I think actually one of my key points needs to be that even though this is all about impacts and impact forecasting, it might be far more influential to be thinking about what action, guidance, information should be in a message. So as I was saying, the evidence around impact-based warnings is sort of a little unclear. It's evenly balanced really between whether they're effective or not at getting at a behavioral response. But if we have clearer action messages in our warnings, then that might be more influential. And I think we need to have more emphasis on that. Understanding what actions are going to save people's lives or reduce the damage more than others, and particularly in a multi-hazard situation. So you've got the whole, if you have a tornado and a flash flood at the same time, do you go in a ditch or not, because you're going to get impacted from the flood if you're not from the tornado. And so understanding at what in what sort of contexts and situations should you be advising people to do different actions. So we really need to have more research done on appropriate actions in these multi-hazard contexts. So yeah, that's definitely a key point I'd like to leave people with, is focusing more on these guidance messages as opposed to just impacts. In terms of data, I think a lot of countries are really emphasizing finding impact data. You'll notice I probably haven't mentioned actual impact data all that much today, because in New Zealand, we've come at it from this quantitative risk model approach where it's been drummed into me that we have exposure data, vulnerability data. Together, those inform what the consequences or impacts are likely to be. And so getting the impact data after an event occurs helps to produce those the vulnerability information that feeds back into the model. Whereas a lot of countries are very focused on just trying to get that impact data in the first place. So I think that's great. You know, we need more impact data collected in a coordinated way and shared between agencies to inform these going forward, even if it's just for a more qualitative, tacit, you know, kind of approach rather than a quantitative risk model. So having these post-event surveys is important, and including social questions in there about where people received their warning from, what did they think, what did they do, but done in a very ethically and morally appropriate way to inform not only the physical damage, but also the human response to these warnings. And that way we can make our warnings more effective. I think that's actually probably the main points, Jen. So yeah, I don't know if there's any more questions.
We've got one more and just a few minutes, and I'm not sure we can fully tackle this in just a few minutes, but it's a great question I want to make sure we touch on. Is it possible to use impact-based forecasting to study regional climate changes?
Wow. So I'm trying to interpret that one. So can you say that one again?
I think if I had to interpret it, let me rephrase it.
Yeah.
Can we use impact-based forecasting to study change over longer periods of time as opposed to a specific event?
Well, you could use impact forecasting and communicating about climate change. You know, like if you know you've got a change in climate and then therefore the impacts are likely to change from events. So that's still weather-based, but you could do that. But then also you could use this more impact forecasting approach to communicate about climate change in terms of the impacts of climate change are likely to be X, Y, Z, you know, but I think you still got to emphasize the actions that people have to take rather than just talking about the climate change itself. Otherwise, people aren't going to know what to do and you've got to empower them. Does that answer that question? I'm still trying to get my head around that one.
I thought it did.
Okay. Yeah.
We got a couple more that just came in that I'm kind of processing through here. Are there any best practices when it comes to the physical communication of information that you all have done research on? Or so, in other words, how do you do your best to ensure that everyone receives a warning?
Right. Yeah. And that very much ties into early warnings for all, right? We've got these new emergency mobile alerts, which are for life-threatening situations where the government can just put out these messages to cell phones. It's like your WEA messages, I believe, presidential level, where they just will all go to all phones within that cell tower radius. So we can do that for our life-threatening events, and they have been used in the Auckland floods recently, and in other areas where you've especially got flooding going on. So that's been great in the last few years, having that come in and make sure everyone's informed. And then it's just heading up a bunch of channels, you know, but basically trying to get it out through Twitter and Facebook, as well as on the radio and the news, phoning up and using local community leaders to help spread that message, that sort of thing. So going through all those channels you can through the various agencies to try and get that highest reach possible.
Wonderful. Well, we're about out of time here. So the slide we have up right now has Dr. Sally Potter's contact information. If you would like to reach out with additional questions. And I also want to note that this presentation has been recorded and it will be posted on the AMS Weatherband website within a few days for those of you asking about the presentation If you are a member, it is free. And any final last words before we wrap up here?
Nothing from me, just thank you very much everyone for joining, and thanks Jen for moderating, and I really appreciate it, enjoyed it, so thank you so much.
Yes, and one reminder from AMS here as well, please consider joining the AMS webinars mailing list to hear about upcoming webinars. That was just dropped in the chat to everyone from AMS. And I think we will end there. So thank you all very much for the great questions and for joining us today for this important conversation with Dr. Sally Potter.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Potter, and thank you so much, Jen, for your time and the work that went into producing this webinar. Folks, audience, as has been mentioned, all webinars will be available to Weatherband members at amsweatherband.org. And also, there are a bunch of really good questions that came up, and we just didn't get time to address them all. But if you would like to take your further questions, if you want to talk about the webinar, we encourage your members to go to the Weatherband Community Forum and put that out there and get the discussion going on that platform. But yes, that being said, once more, I'd like to thank everybody. Again, thank you, Sally. Thank you, Jen, so much. And have a great day, everybody. Have a great morning, Dr. Potter.
Thank you.